Pastor Fred.
All right, thank you, Abby. Well, we've been doing the Lord's Prayer, which is right in the middle of the Sermon on the Mount, and we're focusing last week and this week on forgiveness. So we're focusing on that part of the prayer, forgive us as we prayed today, our debts, as we forgive our debtors. Depending on what church you might have grown up in, you might have prayed, forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us, or forgive us our sins as we forgive those who sin against us. But it's interesting how receiving forgiveness and giving forgiveness are closely tied together. We're called to live in a spirit of forgiveness. Forgiveness is a way of life, actually. Our capacity for love and joy and freedom are directly correlated to our capacity to forgive. And by the way, forgiveness is not always easy, right? So we're going to talk about how sometimes forgiveness can be extremely difficult, yet incredibly important to work through. Many of you know that I've been a cyclist for decades, and there have been years where I have ridden over 10,000 miles in the Northland on my road bike in 1 year. There were years when I was in my peak competitive years where I would put more miles on my bicycle than my truck in a year, all right? So, so pretty dedicated. And back when I first started riding roads, people weren't texting and driving. There were no texting drivers, right? And yet, it was still crazy dangerous. Like, I've had people cuss me out for riding my bike on the road. I've had people throw stuff at me. I've had beer cans thrown at me. I've had all kinds of things. I've had people flip me off. You just can't imagine. And many, many times, I'm not even impeding their progress. I'm just on the road on a bike and somebody doesn't like it. Remember one time me and a friend were riding on interurban way up by, between Camden Point and Dearborn. No cars on the road. It was, early in the morning. And this elderly lady starts honking at us. There's just two of us on the road. There's nobody else and her. She could have just driven by us. We wouldn't have slowed her down. She starts honking, and she rolls down her window, and she slows down, and she just starts dropping the F-bomb on us. And we're riding side by side. Her car's right here. We're looking at her. And I just sat there, and I was kind of stunned. It's like there's no other vehicles on the road. And I looked at her, and I said, "Grandma shouldn't talk that way." And then she had another explicative and then just drove away, One time I was riding way up north of Trimble, and it was in the winter, and I'd gone out when it wasn't snowing and sleeting, but I got caught way north when it started snowing and sleeting on me, and I'm alone on a bike, and I'm sitting there going, God, I'm an idiot. This is so stupid. Why am I doing this? I'm on a 50-something mile ride. I'm stuck now. It's sleeting on me. I have, wanting to get back home. And this car comes up behind me and then slows down, does the same thing, rolls his window down. He looks at me, and I'm riding my bike. I'm looking at him, and he goes, "You're an idiot." And I just looked at it and said, I was just thinking the same thing. And So one time, I was over here, actually on Berry Road, no cars around. Guy pulls around me and starts just honking. There's no cars. I'm on the side of the road, no cars. He's honking. When he goes by me, he fixates in his rearview mirror and is giving me sign language. And as he's giving me sign language and fixated on me backwards in his rearview mirror, he starts drifting off the road. And all of a sudden, it looks like he's going to crash into a hard concrete median that's down there by Amity and Berry, and I was headed eastbound toward Liberty. And he's drifting off the road. And all of a sudden, he somehow came to a sense. I thought he's going to crash, and then I'm going to have to call 911. And I'm a little ticked at him because there's nobody around and he's flipping me off in his rearview mirror. But as he caught himself, didn't crash. But I thought, that's kind of almost like a metaphor for how forgiveness and unforgiveness and bitterness can hurt us. If we get hurt by somebody and then we refuse to forgive, it's almost like fixating in that rearview mirror. We're fixated on the past. We're armoring up with anger, revenge, bitterness, and then we take that into our spirit and it kind of crashes everything else around us, because I think our human spirit is not built to carry bitterness, resentment, hatred. We're built for love. God creates us for extraordinary love. So let's talk first about what is forgiveness. What is forgiveness not? Okay, forgiveness is not, and these are some common misunderstandings. Forgiveness is not condoning a person's behavior. Okay? So let's face it, some people do some evil things, some people do hurtful things, some people do harmful things. Sometimes people even commit crimes that are hurtful against your person and your being. And so a lot of times when we come to forgiveness, we feel like we're condoning bad, evil, hurtful, harmful behavior of another person. That is not what forgiveness is about. Another one is forgiveness is not just forgetting. Some people think that you have to forget the hurt and the harm that somebody caused you in order to get to a place of forgiveness. It's not about forgetting. We remember, but those memories become gradually filled with grace and love versus hatred, revenge, bitterness. So it's not about forgetting, but it is about healing. And then another one is it's not about being a doormat. Sometimes, like if you're living with an abusive person, if you're working with a person that's hurtful and harmful, a lot of times you can think, oh, well, if I forgive this person, then I'm just permitting them to be hurtful the rest of their lives toward me. And actually, that's not the case. You can forgive somebody and still set very meaningful boundaries that protect you from future harm. Okay? So those are things that forgiveness is not. Let's ask another question. Who is forgiveness for? If somebody's hurt you and wounded you, sometimes we can think, well, if I forgive them, then maybe they'll ask for forgiveness. Maybe it'll help change them. And the reality is that may happen. If you forgive somebody, they may soften, their heart may soften, they might change, forgive, ask forgiveness, but that's not why you do it. Forgiveness is really for yourself. It helps free you to love, to experience joy, and to experience freedom. There's a lot of versions of this little quick phrase, but Anne Lamott is one of the people that I know. She's one of my favorite authors. And she says that bitterness is like taking rat poison and then expecting the rat to die. So when we armor up with hatred and unforgiveness and bitterness and revenge, it's like us swallowing that poison down, the poison of bitterness, and then we expect the other person to die and suffer from it. All along, we're the ones that are swallowing the poison. So the reason why we forgive and commit to a lifestyle of forgiveness is because it sets us free. It really creates space in our lives that we can move forward and continue to experience love and joy and freedom. So forgiveness is really about freeing ourselves from the harmful impact of bitterness, revenge, hatred, and unforgiveness. Really, forgiveness is about letting go of the armor that we want to put on to protect ourselves from future hurt. It's letting go of the debt that we feel like somebody owes us. If you had a parent who was abusive and you've worked through anger and grief and all of that, you can look at that parent and you could arm up with bitterness and anger and hatred, or you can let it go And you can basically say, hey, I'm going to let go of the anger. I'm going to let go of the hatred. I'm going to let go of revenge. I'm not condoning what you did. I'm going to draw a boundary. I'm not going to let you hurt me like that again. So sometimes we need to X people out, right? Because they're too hurtful over and over and over again. But it is saying, I am going to let go of the debt. You owed me to be a good dad. You owed me to be a good mom. You owed me to be a good husband. You owed me to be a good wife. You owed me. And we armor up with that anger, revenge, hurt, resentment, bitterness. But in forgiveness, we basically are saying, hey, I'm going to let it go. Sometimes somebody might have committed a crime. You let it go to the justice system. Sometimes it's not a crime, but they've hurt you, and you just give it to God. And you just trust them with somebody else other than yourself. You're not going to be the one that executes the punishment. You're going to let it go. And so I let go of what you owe me. I'm going to set myself free from that. And I'm going to let you go, trust you to the universe, to God, to the justice, whatever. All right? So that's really what forgiveness is about, is taking down the armor. And I really think that deep down in our hearts, we long for love, we long for belonging, we long for connection. That's a part of being created in the image of God. And we really, really long to not live our lives in anger and bitterness and and unforgiveness. So we long for that beauty of forgiveness. There's a story about a golfer that was really famous in the 60s from Argentina named Roberto de Cinzo. He was well loved. He had a great personality. People cheered for him. He'd won a U.S. Open and all different things. But one time, right after he'd won an event, a woman caught him and shared a story with him. And she was a single mom, and she said that her daughter was going through like some kind of cancer treatment. She couldn't afford the treatments as a young daughter. And she was facing potential homelessness, and she just went through a litany of things. And he was so moved by her story that he just took the check that he just received. Of course, they weren't nearly as big as they are today back in the 60s, but he took that check, he just flipped it over, he signed the back of it. This is old school days when we had checks, right? And he handed it to her. Well, a week later, a guy came up to him that was doing an interview with him. He said, hey, by the way, that woman that you signed that check to last week, she's a con. She's not a single mom. She doesn't have a daughter who's dying of cancer. And she doesn't, da-da-da-da-da. And he looked at the interviewer and he says, do you mean to tell me that there's no young girl who's suffering from cancer? And the guy said, yeah, that's right. And he says, that's the best news I've heard all day. Perspective, right? Perspective. So this heart of forgiveness is really about a way of life. It's committing to a lifestyle of forgiveness. A couple of quotes. This is Albert Camus. We all carry within us places of exile, our crimes, our ravages. Our task is not to unleash them on the world. It is to transform them in ourselves and others. So we're transforming our deepest hurts and pains into something way more beautiful that serves the world with beauty and love and grace. Another quote from Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. This is an older quote. If we could read the secret history of our enemies, we would find in each man's life sorrow and suffering enough to disarm all hostilities. In other words, if we could, even the person who's offended us, if we actually knew their full story, all the hurt, all the trauma, all the things that they've gone through, then it might just disarm our anger and resentment and bitterness and help bring us to a place of more grace and love. Now, in my life, I've actually always been a pretty quick forgiver. Literally, haven't struggled with deep, deep bitterness very many times in my life. But what I went through the last several years, I had a dear, deep friend do some amazingly hurtful things, like deep slander, deep hurt, deep betrayal, at my darkest moment. A friend that I had been there for many, many, many times. I had honestly never, ever been betrayed by a longtime friend in my entire life. My friends from junior high, high school, and college are still friends to this day, except for this one situation. And it was a deep hurt and a deep pain. And I was in my own, I had blown up, I had done things, I had hurt people, I was trying to take responsibility for my own difficulties and the harm that I'd caused other people. But to have a close friend like that then betray me in the midst of that, when I had been there for him in many, many situations, it was just, it was extraordinarily hard. And it made me angry. I'm not the kind of person who gets angry and then wants to beat somebody up. But this time I did. I had visions of having a baseball bat. And did any of you ever see the movie 42? When Jackie Robinson is being racially slurred, and he's the first black player in Major League Baseball. And he gets so angry at the racism that he has to deal with all the time. There's this scene where he takes a baseball bat and he just goes in the locker room, just starts beating the crap out of the locker room because of the racism that he has to face. And I had that image in my head. I thought, if I just had a baseball bat. And then I changed it. I said a Nerf baseball bat. And just get, but anger, right? Because sometimes people do things that are unjust, that are extraordinarily hurtful. And it can be some of the deepest hurts that we can go through. Think about the racism. Think about the murders due to bigotry. Think about the wars around the world that people have suffered and endured, the genocides that people suffered and endured. One of my friends that I met back in 2008 lives in the West Bank. He's a Palestinian, and he lives in Bethlehem, which is in the West Bank right now. A lot of people don't realize this, but the hostilities that you see going on right now in Israel and Gaza, there's a backdrop for that, right? Israel as a modern state didn't come about until 1948. And if you look at the history of the nation of Israel, the last time they had been like a self-governing nation was under King David and Solomon, and then you had the divided kingdoms to the north and the south. And then when the first temple was destroyed under the Babylonian captivity, Israel hadn't been a self-governing nation since that time. So it had been almost 2,500 years. But due to the guilt of the Holocaust and all the dynamics around that, and all the anti-Semitism that was going on in Europe prior to the World War II, there was just a ton of guilt, and people the British made a mandate and just said, hey, we're gonna give Jewish people this ancient land that has multiple people who have been living there for generations, for thousands of years. And so when Israel became a nation, they had to fight a war and actually move families who had lived there for hundreds of years off the land. And guess who those people are? They're Palestinians. Those people that lived on the land before 1948 were either Palestinian Muslims or Palestinian Christians. They were pushed, their land was taken, their homes were taken, they were actually pushed into refugee camps. And there's dozens of these refugee camps that have been in existence since 1948, and these families have lived there. They're like slums, and they've grown up there ever since. Sammy's family, his grandfather, was killed in 1948, lost their home, lost their land that dated back 800 years. They were Palestinian Christians, and they were moved into the West Bank in Bethlehem, and then they have lived ever since under Israeli military occupation in the West Bank, just like Gaza has, okay? So these people are basically in huge refugee camps. Their land was stolen, family was murdered when Israel became a nation. So think about it. The Israeli Jewish people had huge trauma in their worlds, what we call collective trauma. But then when they took over the land, they created huge trauma, collective trauma in the Palestinian people, right? A lot of times people don't understand that story. So I was able to interview Sammy Awad this week from Bethlehem. Okay, this is in the West Bank, and he has family members in Gaza. There's been over 40,000 innocent lives, mostly, killed in Gaza over the last 9 months since October 7th. It's a horrendous kind of situation. Sammy and his family have been fighting for peace and justice in nonviolent, civil disobedient protest ways in order to gain the rights and the voting rights and the civil rights for Palestinian people. Today, there's less than 1% Palestinian Christians, and Sammy's dad, Bashara, started Bethlehem Bible College in 1981. So I've hung out with his family in the West Bank. I've toured many of these refugee camps in and around Israel. I have Palestinian friends that are Muslim, Palestinian friends that are Christians, and I have Jewish friends and Israeli friends that are Jewish, all right? And the horrendous trauma in both of these people is just crazy. Sammy's family and Sammy himself has been doing forgiveness, peace, nonviolent justice work their whole life. And I want to play just one quick clip. You could listen to the whole interview on my Spirituality Adventures YouTube channel, but I want to play you just a quick clip from this interview that I just did this week. By the way, Sammy's mother, he's taking care of his father and mother. His father has dementia. His mother was struggling with MS, and she just died yesterday. I just did this interview Tuesday with Sammy, and he's been staying with his mom and dad, taking care of them in Bethlehem. And I just found out she just passed away yesterday. But let's roll this quick clip. Again, this is about forgiveness.
Your family has been working with basically nonviolent, taking a page out of Gandhi or Martin Luther King Jr., nonviolent civil rights protests. You've been put in jail. Mubarak, your uncle, has been called the Gandhi of the West Bank. Give us just a little feel for that work that's been going on for you and your family for your whole life. I mean, you started doing this when you were a teenager.
No, I was 12 years old when
12 years old.
My first, so it was before I was a teenager.
Wow.
Pre-teen. Yeah. It's all honor is given to my grandmother in this. After her husband was killed in 1948 and she buried him in the courtyard of the house, she insisted, and she was a woman of faith, that as a Christian family, because I think she understood Jesus better than 99% of Christians today understand Jesus, sadly to say this, that we will never seek revenge and retaliation for what happened to us, because Jesus never fought revenge and retaliation for what happened to them. To him, he was on the cross and he said, forgive them for what they do. And she took this to her heart. This is what Jesus teaches us. So we need to forgive them for what they did to us. We will never take revenge and retaliate against them for what they did. At the same time, Jesus calls us to be peacemakers. So it's not about ignoring. It's not about running away. It's about actively engaging in making peace with those who you have forgiven and want to build a better relationship with. This is how she would define justice even. Justice is the process of seeking peace and reconciliation with those who have harmed you. It's not revenge, not retaliation, not making them pay for what they did, not getting back what I lost even from them. And then that was the seed that she planted in her children and us as grandchildren. And I could tell you at least one of my daughters is moving in that direction as a great grandchild of this amazing woman who taught us this. And at the same time, we believe that nonviolence is the more right, strategically, and more powerful option to achieve the goals that we need to achieve as Palestinians. Violence has never gotten us anything. And every time we see violence, it gives an excuse and a justification for the Israeli system to engage in fierce amounts of violence and collective punishment towards Palestinians. What's happening in Gaza is at a high level of intensity, but it's important to say it is not new. Collective punishment for acts of violence by Palestinians, acts of resistance by Palestinians, armed resistance, whatever we want to call it, have always been responded to with collective punishment of the family, of the community, of the area that this person would have come from. And so we are aware of this. This has been our experience. So this is why we say nonviolence is always a better option, because at one point it also tries to put an end to the cycle of violence. When you're engaging in nonviolence, it doesn't mean that the other side engages in nonviolence. They will probably respond to violence. As you said, we've been arrested, we've been detained, we've been beaten up. An uncle of mine has been deported, violently deported because of his engagement in nonviolence. But at a certain point of time, a tipping point, a turning point happens where that society begins to realize we cannot continue to act in violence towards these people who are nonviolent towards us. Why are we doing this? The collective consciousness of a community arises. This is what happened in the United States. This is what happened in India. We cannot justify the use of violence anymore because they are not being violent towards us. How can we justify it other than us just being violent murderers? And this is not what we want to be. So the excuse that we're just defending ourselves has no bearing when it comes to acts of nonviolent resistance.
Yeah, so forgiveness isn't always easy. I said that, right? And so, if you've had abuse towards you, if you've had family members killed, think about Ukrainians right now, think about Gazans right now, think about our black brothers and sisters that were growing up in the Jim Crow South, that were threatened if they tried to vote, that were killed, that were lynched. When you've had family members murdered by the enemy, then we want to arm up, right? With hatred and revenge and retaliation. But then this just creates the cycle. And it's true even on a micro, it's true in our families. It's true in our working places. It's true in our city. It's true in our state. It's true in our nation. It's true in every place around the world. When we armor up with revenge and hatred and trying to get even, then we just create a cycle of hatred and violence that never ends, because your harm is always worse than the other person's harm. And the only way to get out of that is to let go. And in letting go, it can be hard because you're thinking, it feels like I'm justifying, I'm saying it's okay what they did. And that's not what we're doing. We're actually saying there's anger. Sometimes people forgive too quickly. There can be deep grief because why? Think about it. Most of you don't get up in the morning and grieve over the Gazan children that have been killed. Why? Because you don't know them. You're not connected to them. But if somebody hurt you at work yesterday, you get up in the morning and you grieve over that. And you might want to get even or get back, right? So most of the time, the reason why we have unforgiveness and bitterness is because somebody close has hurt us deeply, or they've hurt a family member of ours, or they've killed a family member of ours. This is deep, deep, difficult work, but it's the work that Jesus taught us to do by his own teaching, by his own lifestyle, by his own death. And through his resurrection, we see hope in all of these situations, that if we practice forgiveness as a way of life, it's hard. I think people can forgive prematurely. I think there's a process, there's a delicacy to forgiveness. It takes time to forgive. Sometimes we need to get in touch with the anger. We need to get in touch with the grief. We need to grieve, and we need to have the anger, but then we have to have this commitment to a more beautiful way of living, which is through forgiveness. And we're called to live a lifestyle. And think about it. Our bodies and everything are creating and recreating all the time. Our bodies, over 100 billion red blood cells are produced every day in your body. 1 billion skin cells slough off of you every day. They say it's like every 7 years you've got a whole new body because your skin is completely replenished within 7 days. And it's a new you. Snakes do it really fast, but we take 7 years. Think about new stomach lining every 5 days. This is because the cells that die off and then are replenished. New eyebrows every 4 months. You didn't know that, did you? Just look in the mirror and go, wow, I'll have a whole new set of eyebrows in 4 months. Or maybe I'll be bald on my eyebrows too. Who knows? You never know. A new liver every 6 weeks. The body is constantly, everything is constantly renewing. Why not our hearts? Our hearts need to be renewed. And forgiveness is the key word. It's difficult, challenging, but it's deeply important. Jesus modeled it for us. Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they do. One of my favorite quotes I'll close with is from C.S. Lewis, and it's on love. And this directly ties into this capacity to love, to experience joy, and to experience freedom is tied to our capacity to forgive. To love at all is to be vulnerable. Love anything, and your heart will be wrung and possibly broken. If you want to make sure of keeping it intact, you must give it to no one, not even an animal. Wrap your heart carefully around with hobbies, little luxuries, avoid all entanglements, lock it up safe in the casket or coffin of your selfishness. But in that casket, safe, dark, motionless, airless, it will change. It will not be broken. It will become unbreakable, impenetrable, irredeemable. To love is to be vulnerable. Our capacity for love, for beauty, for joy, for freedom is truly tied to this way of life that we commit to. And it's a process, and it's delicate, and it can be challenging, and there's all kinds of angles to it. But it's directly tied to our capacity to forgive. Jesus, Father, forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. Let's pray. God, come, do a work in our hearts today. We ask for the spirit of forgiveness to invade our hearts and our lives. And give us, even when it's difficult and challenging, even when we want to armor up and get even and get angry, help us to work through that and grieve that, but then help us to wind back around to that place of truly forgiving and loving and walking in that forgiveness. And so we pray this, and Raina's going to lead us in a song of